Welcome to Mental Health First Aid England session on grief and bereavement. My name is Sue Bennett and I'm an Associate Instructor and National Trainer for Mental Health First Aid England. I was also part of the Instructor Training Programme for Thrive London initiative, so it's great to be part of this CPD. I hope you find the session enjoyable and useful. So although this is a pre-recorded session and there'll be no sharing of experiences, it's really important to still acknowledge your possible emotive responses around the subject matter. I'd like you to be really mindful of this. We will all likely to have experienced some grief or loss in our lives, and for some of you this may be quite a recent event. So please do consider whether it's the right time to take part in this CPD, or certainly seek support if you need it. The aim of the session is to aid your role as mental health first aiders when supporting children, young people or adults who are dealing with grief and the emotional pain that can result from that loss. By the end of the session, some few or all of you will hopefully take away a greater understanding of what we mean when we hear the term grief. We'll be able to identify statements that may be helpful when supporting individuals affected by grief, and we'll gain a brief insight into the concept of grief recovery. We'll also recall your learning of some of the mental health first aid core concepts or models that are helpful when supporting individuals affected by grief. So what is grief and bereavement? Well, in relatively simple terms, bereavement can be described as the state of having lost someone to death. It's the facts of the loss. Grief is the normal and natural reaction to such a loss. And that's concerned with the cognitive, the emotional, the functional and behavioural responses to that loss. In other words, the way that we think, the way that we feel and the way that we act. Now, whilst grief is deemed normal and natural, it also can be a misunderstood experience. Imagine you know someone that has had a prolonged painful illness. When they die, you may feel a sense of relief that they no longer have to live in constant pain. But it also means that you'll not see them again. So this, together with that sense of relief, comes the painful feelings for you. These conflicting feelings of relief and sadness are totally normal in response to death, or if something is caused by a change or an end in a familiar pattern of behaviour. And like most life events, the impact grief has on individuals will vary considerably in both intensity and length from person to person. We use the term mourning to describe the behavioural presentations of grief which are often influenced by social and cultural customs. Culture and religion significantly influence how people grieve and how communities support mourning individuals. We all experienced a period of national mourning earlier in the year when the Queen died. The Cabinet Office published a guidance document which outlined how individuals and businesses could mourn the death of the longest serving monarch. Certain protocol was observed right up to the time of her funeral, and then that was followed by a period of personal mourning for the royal family. And for some cultures, grief is an enduring experience that never ends, but evolves. Just think back for a moment to your mental health first aid training and recall the frame of reference, our individual window on the world around perceptions, values and beliefs. Death and dying practices vary throughout the world, and they are influenced by factors including culture, religion, personal beliefs and community traditions. So when we're supporting someone who's experiencing distress caused by grief or loss, it's important to understand, where possible, their beliefs about death or grieving practices. Bear in mind what you may view as typical or normal in your cultural experience may be very different from the person or persons that you are supporting. Know that depending on their cultural beliefs, they may or may not express outward signs of grieving, or may express very vocal and intense signs of grieving. Some carry out rituals and practices as part of the death and rebirth process, with family and loved ones being involved right up to the final moments. Others have set period of mourning where the community supports the family. and some favour the cremation or burial to take place within 24 hours of the death. It's important to acknowledge in the UK that may not be possible due to the administrative protocol and processes that have to take place, and this, of course, can increase the sense of grief. So how do we know how to support someone who's grieving if they have a different faith, belief, or are from a different ethnic group? We may have assumptions with regards to how they react to death or loss, but we need to sense, to feel, and to listen to create a better understanding of others. Learning more by creating a clearer picture helps us support people with their grief. If you aren't sure about something or don't understand, ask with integrity and use the whole algae approach, using a non-judgmental, genuine tone, and talk and share about the knowledge. Now, we tend to associate grief with death. However, there are more than 40 life events that can produce feelings of grief, but sadly, society doesn't always recognise these losses as grief issues. However, we grieve for the loss of any relationship that is deemed significant, therefore creating emotions or feelings. Grief is a natural reaction to any significant emotional loss. And if you refer back to when you did your stress container activity in your training, there may have been factors that you included as stressors that produced a sense of grief. Do you remember we said earlier that grief is the conflicting feelings caused by the end of or change in a familiar pattern of behaviour? So change in personal circumstances can cause feelings of grief. Many of these losses listed here are likely to overlap, particularly as our own life path is unique to us. As we age, we may sense a feeling of loss with regards to our youth, not being able to do things that we could before, and indeed our hearing, our vision, or our mental capacity may result in a feeling of grief. Individuals that experience life-changing injuries through accidents or trauma cause a change in the familiar pattern of behaviour and can bring about a loss of control over situations. Transitional life events bring about change, even those with a positive outcome such as marriage or birth. But it may also indicate the loss of identity for some individuals. Consider those that experience a feeling of empty nest syndrome when the children begin to leave home, or the changes that happen in our children and young people's lives, such as changing schools and the varying friendship circles. If we can recognise and remember that everyone is individual, we can support a person through their feelings of loss, which may be conflicted at times, with genuineness, acceptance and empathy. Grief's not linear, it's multi-layered and it's individual. We're not sufficiently prepared to deal with the grief that's caused by significant emotional loss. So let's have a look at the considered stages of grief. The model or concept that 5 stages of grief actually exists was written in Kubler-Ross's book called Death and Dying in 1969. And this was as a result of her working as a psychiatrist in America. Her work was a reflection of the grief process that she witnessed of patients who had been diagnosed with terminal illness. The framework began with her observations and interviews with people who were nearing death and their emotions that they had or were experiencing as they faced their own deaths. The model has been extended over time to consider that the stages can be applied to grief other than death and is often used in organisations to support change management, where we can identify that things like change in job role, organisational mergers, change of premises or redundancy can impact significantly on an individual and they may experience a sense of loss. So the 5 stages of the Kubler-Ross theory are as follows. Denial. Denial is not only an attempt to pretend that the loss does not exist. At this point, we're also trying to absorb and understand what's happening. In the first stage of the grieving process, denial helps us to minimise the overwhelming pain of loss. As we process the reality of our loss, we're also trying to survive emotional pain. And during this stage in grieving, our reality is shifted completely. It can take our minds time to adjust to our new reality. The second stage is anger, and this can be expressed in many ways. While some take out the anger on themselves, others may direct it towards others around them. People tend to remain irritable, frustrated, and short-tempered during this stage and often look for someone to blame. It can make us seem unapproachable when what we would benefit from is comfort, connection, and reassurance. Bargaining comes from a feeling of helplessness and gives us a perceived sense of control over something that feels so out of control. During bargaining, we tend to focus on our personal faults or regrets. We might look back at our interactions with the person we're losing or have lost and note all the times we felt disconnected or may have caused them pain. It's common to recall times when we may have said things we did not mean and wish we could go back and behave differently. We also sometimes make the drastic assumption that if things had played out differently, we'd not be in such an emotional, painful place in our lives. We all know from our mental health first aider training that clinical depression requires 3 core symptoms. However, reactionary depression may occur after a loss. During our experience of processing grief, there comes a time when our imaginations calm down and we slowly start to look at the reality of our present situation. Bargaining no longer feels like an option and we're faced with what's happening. In this stage of grieving, we start to feel the loss more abundantly. In those moments, we tend to pull inward as the sadness grows. We might find ourselves retreating, being less sociable, and reaching out less to others about what we're going through. Although this is a very natural stage in the grieving process, dealing with the depression after a loss can be extremely isolating. When we come to a place of acceptance, it's not that we no longer feel the pain of the loss. Instead, we're no longer resisting the reality of our situation, and we're not struggling to make it something different. Sadness and regret can still be present in this phase, but the emotional survival tactics of denial, bargaining, and anger are less likely to be present during this phase of the grieving process. What do we feel about the Kubler-Ross theory? Many people, professionals and the public alike, have attempted to apply her stages to the emotions that arise after a loss, but it does have its critics. If we believe that we must experience the Kubler-Ross's stages of grief, it can be quite unhelpful. For example, if we don't go through an angry stage, will we believe that we're not progressing through our grief in the way that we should? There should be no expectations, as we know that grief is individual to us all, and each time we experience a loss, it may change yet again. It's really important as mental health first aiders that we recognise that grief is individual. Grief is much more than just sadness, and we might be overwhelmed by a variety of different emotions and feelings in our body as our grief changes over time. The thoughts that we experience when impacted by grief may be similar to times of when we're feeling low, anxious or stressed, and how we think impacts on how we feel, and how we feel can impact on our thoughts and subsequently our behaviour. When we're grieving, we can experience both positive and negative thoughts. We can remember the good times and smile with that thought, or we can remember the good times and cry based on that memory. We may also experience a period of negative rumination. Rumination can lead to self-blame, guilt, or shame. We might become fixated on focusing on that negative aspect, maybe about the unfairness of the situation or anger at the loss. I'm sure at some point we've all experienced that element of where we believed we should have said or done something differently, or we could have done more, or things could have been better. If we can learn to emotionally process the thoughts that we're having, this can often produce more positivity and can often lead to feelings of acceptance around the loss. Our emotions can be draining on our bodies in a physical sense. We may feel sick at times, which may lead to not wanting to eat. If we don't eat, that may lead to a feeling of lethargy and irritability. We might have a loss of motivation. We may struggle to concentrate on tasks in hand. And if we're in a situation where we're having to deal with finances or legal matters relevant to the loss, this can cause a variety of emotions and feelings. When grievers are asked how they're feeling, some will respond and just say, "I'm numb or empty." There's a feeling that the body and mind at that time is completely devoid of any emotions whatsoever. Remember that the conflicting feelings that occur, maybe relief and sadness, are part of the natural response to any emotional significant loss caused by a change of a familiar pattern or behaviour. So we've looked at thoughts and feelings, and we know that someone grieving is likely to act on those and bring about a change in behaviour. This is what we'd recognise as a mental health first aider, especially if we know the person well. Studies suggest added stress can limit your ability to control unwanted behaviours, leading you to make poor dietary choices, forget exercise, and indulge more in overeating, smoking, and caffeine consumption, for example. These can all further the symptoms of grief to make them more noticeable, and some people may avoid being alone or avoid being with others. Others may carry on as normal, maybe in a denial state. Often bringing a sense of closeness to the person that has died comes from surrounding ourselves with their prized possessions, photos, or visiting their resting place. Or for others, grief may result in getting rid of personal belongings as quickly as possible. Remember that grief is individual and we all deal with it differently. As a mental health first aider, we have our action plan, our framework, and as with any form of distress, we ensure that the person is not at risk or crisis and effectively apply LG. So in order to help manage the feelings and emotions that are experienced, the loss must be managed using the right tools for the job. And some of those tools need to be led by the heart and not the head. As a supportive mental health first aider, what tools do you have that you can apply to support someone who is grieving? Of course, it's the L out of algae. Taking the time to listen non-judgmentally can be as supportive as we know. Most comments grievers hear following a loss have some intelligence attached to them, but they are often completely void of any emotions. If you recall your training as a mental health first aider, you will have looked at helpful and unhelpful language around mental health. The Grief Recovery Institute in the USA surveyed several bereaved people and reported on 143 different statements that people had heard in the first 40 hours of their grieving. Some were considered to be helpful to grievers and some were not. Just for a couple of seconds, self-reflect on some statements that you have had said to you, or indeed you may have used yourself. Have you had or have you used the at least statement? Something like, at least you were able to spend the last few months with her when an anticipated death has occurred. At least they're not in pain anymore. Or maybe you've heard, I'm sorry to hear that your cat died. You can always get another one for company. We need to be strong for the children. These are not necessarily helpful. If we can be emotionally truthful when supporting someone, particularly if it's in the early stages of the loss, then this can be much more helpful. It's starting with your honesty for one thing, so you're acknowledging that you don't know how they feel, because how could you? Even if you've experienced a loss very similar, you'll never know what the other person is truly feeling because grief is individual. Some more maybe helpful statements are, I can't begin to imagine how you feel. I don't know how you feel. There are no words to express. I'm deeply sorry for your loss. I wish my words could do more to help you. These are genuine and emotional, truthful statements. And certainly by offering something practical, this can be most helpful in those early stages of grief. In this part of the session, we'll cover a little more about grief, and then we'll look at how we might be able to manage grief with children and young people. When someone dies, you might experience many losses, and this can also be related to a relationship breakdown or divorce and other losses that we've already looked at. And sometimes the less tangible losses are the ones we struggle to cope with. So part of grieving is recognising what you've lost, and loss can come with many changes that are not always immediately visible. There's the physical loss of the person and their presence, and other less tangible losses, such as the shared life, things that you did together and for each other. What does the future now look like, particularly if there were plans and dreams set as a couple or as a family? When a relationship breaks down, a person moves away or dies, it can impact considerably on social and support networks. What does it now look like for the person left behind? Do friends now have to make choices? This can add to the grief in a variety of ways. And the final one is often quite impacting for older people, where perhaps one partner has always been in charge of the finances, the shopping or the cooking. The change can be immense and the loss can be reignited with every new experience. So, as we've already said, grief is individual, and not all losses are the same, and not all losses affect us in the same way. The circumstances of the loss can affect how you grieve. So before we consider the recovery from grief, it's important to consider the nature of the loss. Anticipated and expected. This is a term you'll hear when a person has been diagnosed with a terminal illness. Their death won't have any less impact, but some people notice they start to grieve before the person has died, or when they've learnt of the illness. Anticipated grief can bring a collection of tumultuous feelings and reactions when waiting for death to occur. The grief may be experienced by the person themselves, it might be the partner, the family, carers, friends, colleagues, and potentially anybody who loves and cares for that person. But not all will recognise it, however, as grief. I'd like to draw your attention to a book called A Matter of Death and Life, which was written by Dr. Irvin Yalom. It's his personal journal about his experience of grief when his wife was diagnosed with an incurable cancer, and it also talks about assisted dying and how they both found peace with that option. You may have lost someone unexpectedly from a health event or from an accident. It's normal for our bodies to go into a state of shock and disbelief as your mind and body tries to understand what's happened. We can relate back to Kubler-Ross and the stage of denial here. Your loved one may have died violently or may have taken their own life. In these circumstances, there are often additional layers of shock and grief. The type of relationship you had with the person can affect the type of grief you experience. What degree of emotional closeness you had with the person, your feelings for them while they were alive, are all factors that can influence the way you grieve for them. Equally, the way the other people react to your loss can support or hinder your grieving. People around us often want us to feel better quickly, but this can sometimes mean that they fail to give us a space to talk about how we are feeling. Other things that are going on in our lives can also affect how much space you have to grieve. You might feel under pressure to care for others, to carry on as normal, or to return to work sooner than you might like. There is no right way to grieve, and no right amount of time to grieve for. The death of a loved one, divorce, or any other form of loss produces an incredible amount of emotional energy. Early on in life, we learn to cover up, hide, or bury our feelings. And we may cover up under food, alcohol, neglect, or other substances. These often short-term emotional energy busters give short-term relief, but it does not give long-term relief from the significant emotional pain caused by the loss. Relate back to the stress container and consider when helpful strategies can become unhelpful. Managing our grief requires a feeling of completeness with our emotions and the relationship we had with the person that died or the loss experienced. If we can be emotionally truthful with ourselves, then we can start to support our recovery and the relief from the significant emotional pain. We need the right tools to do the job though, as we said before. If you have a garden that's overgrown with weeds, you can chop at them to give some short-term relief, but they will grow back. You can, however, pull up the weeds, root and all, and eliminate the problem. But we need to recognise that the job itself either requires time to devote to it or a support network that can help with it. It's not an overnight solution, and nor is recovery from grief. Long-term relief is the pathway to recovery. Time is key to support recovery from grief, and I'm sure that we've all heard the phrase, time heals all wounds. Dr. Lois Tonkins' model of grief challenges that idea. People feel as though it's impossible to ever move on from grief. Dr. Tonkins suggests that this is because we do not move on from grief but grow around it. If you're experiencing grief, it can become all-consuming at the start. Tonkin gets you to draw a circle that represents your life and everything in it. She then gets you to shade the area of grief. And when a loss happens, it can feel that it overtakes your life. Many people think, and sometimes the expectation is, that it's the grief that then starts to shrink with time. The memories fade, the love and the relationship becomes less dominant. However, over time you'll have new experiences, find pleasure from some of the memories, and still be able to cherish the love and relationship, but it will be very different. You may meet new people and begin to find increased moments of enjoyment. Eventually, there will be a much larger circle with the same size shaded area inside it, and now the grief is not as dominant. This is why Tonkin's model of grief is called growing around grief. This does not mean the grief disappears. It will probably always be there and may even grow a little bit bigger at difficult times, but it no longer completely dominates the circle. It is okay to feel angry, let down, or guilty at times. Death ends life, it doesn't end the relationship, and recovery is identifying a different relationship with that person. You can still smile, giggle, and laugh. It's okay to do that too. There's no right way to grieve or the right amount of time to grieve for. However, some people's grief seems to last longer than others. It follows a different course and does not seem to improve. Psychiatrists sometimes call this prolonged grief or complicated grief. The main difference from uncomplicated grief is that the strong reactions continue at an unbearable intensity for much longer and impact the bereaved person's life in powerful ways. If we recall algae and reflect on quadrant 2 of the mental health continuum, we will, as mental health first aiders, consider the 3 questions that we can ask, particularly for people who are sitting in bottom right-hand quadrant of the continuum. We often refer to them as the 3 Ds. Duration. How long have you been feeling like this? Distress. Is it getting worse? Disabling. Is it affecting your everyday life? And by identifying the responses to these questions will help form our next steps in respect to possible support for the individual. Prolonged grief can stop people living their lives, so early intervention can help prevent this. As we move on to think about how we may be able to support children and young people who are grieving, I want to draw your attention to this definition of mental health. Mental health influences how we think and feel about ourselves and others, and how we interpret events. It affects our capacity to learn, to communicate, and to form, sustain, and end relationships. It also influences our ability to cope with change, transition, and life events, such as having a baby, moving house, or experiencing bereavement. You'll see that I've emboldened some pertinent words as they relate to loss which can cause feelings of grief. They are potentially significant emotional losses that can cause conflicting feelings due to a change in regular pattern or behaviour. We want our children and young people to develop psychologically, emotionally, intellectually and spiritually, so when teaching or supporting them around loss and change, we as adults need to be emotionally truthful about events. So communication is key. If we don't use the words, it can cause confusion for children and in some cases fear. If we're not honest about a life event, how do we expect our children and young people to deal with their emotions and build their resilience for further losses as they grow older? Remember the definition that we've just looked at. Some of those life events that inevitably will at some point create a sense of grieving. What we do know is that some people go to extreme lengths to avoid talk about death, and some don't use the word. As adults, we hear, "She's passed away," or "It's a year since we lost mother." When it comes to children, it's more beneficial to introduce the words as early as possible and be truthful about it so that we can empower them with positive, effective methods of dealing with loss. If a child asks, "Where's Grandpa?" is it beneficial to say that Grandpa's gone to sleep and he won't wake up? Does that not merely instill a sense of fear into a child who then may spend the next 6 months being afraid to go to sleep at night? Little children are very literal. They do not grasp the idea that words do not mean exactly what they say. Euphemisms and metaphors are baffling to children. Same with the myth of that we have to be strong for each other. I remember a friend saying to me that every time she wanted to cry after she'd split from her husband, that she would go to her room so that the children didn't see her cry. Would it not be more helpful to show strength in a different way by naturally demonstrating our emotions and by saying and doing what is emotionally accurate? This hopefully then helps children how to communicate feelings and not bury them. Our frame of reference is born out of what we experience as children, and with children watching everything we do and learning from it, we must become aware that our beliefs and actions will become their beliefs and actions. Skirting sensitive issues may feel safer for the adult, but it may do a disservice to the child. In the late 19th century, and for most of the first half of the 20th century, a viewing or visitation of a dead person would take place in the parlour of a home. The cosmetology and dressing of the body would often be undertaken by the women and girls of the family. And naturally, as they made the preparations, the family would talk about the person they were preparing. The body with its presence acted as a stimulus to remind each person of the unique and individual relationship they had with the person who died. And children learned to touch a dead body and to talk openly and honestly about the person and their death. So we could say that over 100 years ago, it was probably reasonable to say that death was part of life. Has the process of preparation and the act of viewing, being moved from the home to a funeral home, lost something essential? I'll leave you with that thought. So when we're supporting a child or young person with grief, we need to first acknowledge how we're feeling. This is about us being emotionally truthful. If you tell them you don't know in a response to a question, or you feel sad, then this is giving them the trust that they need in you and also gives them the permission to feel sad. Be patient, listen, and don't judge. Keep the conversation short to allow them time to absorb what you're saying and leave space for a response. And remember that any reaction, however it is presented, is an expression of their emotions. We don't want to tell them off for the action. We need to be able to support them through that expression of emotion. Present information in a way the child can understand so it's appropriate for their own emotional maturity. Be direct, use simple and easy to understand language. Comfort and support them in their sadness. They may not or cannot express themselves with words at this time, so consider other methods. Pens, paper for drawing may help them express how they feel. Overall, what they need in this process is for the adults to be caring and supportive, willing to listen, answer questions, and acknowledge how the child or young person is feeling. Humanise the grief with accurate information and support which will help them understand the world around us. I'd like to introduce you to this video which has an interesting take on using the lyrics of the Beatles songs to support someone who is grieving. It's a short video clip by David Trickey, a psychologist at Anna Freud Centre. On the next slide, please click on the play button for it to play for you within this recording. If it doesn't activate, I've left the link in the final slide on the recording for you to watch. I hope you found the session useful, and I want to finish with a plea. As with the 2020 change to the educational curriculum around introducing mental health into the PSHE syllabus, There's a current article looking at including the subject matter of death, dying and bereavement. The link is here if you are interested in reading it. Crews are asking for support to get the topic raised so that our children and young people are given age-appropriate education to help children understand that death is part of life. Thank you. And just before we finish, this slide contains the links that relate to what's being covered in the session. I have a link here which, if you could take a couple of minutes to complete, it would be most appreciated so that we can make these sessions as useful as possible. I've also included my details should you require any further information, or feel free to contact Mental Health First Aid England. Thank you for your participation today, and goodbye.